And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Brian Rose, with whom many of you I know will already be familiar thanks to his truly tireless efforts on behalf of both the Penn Museum and the field of archaeology as a whole. Brian is the James B. Pritchard Professor of Archaeology in the Department of Classical Studies here at Penn, and the Peter C. Ferry Curator-in-Charge of the Mediterranean section of the museum. He was also my predecessor as Deputy Director, and during his time in this position, Brian actually created the great series, which has turned out to be such an unqualified success. Brian has degrees from Haverford College and Columbia University and has excavated extensively, particularly in Turkey, at the sites of Aphrodisias, Troy, and Gordion, this last being one of the museum's major ongoing excavations. In addition to excavating, Brian publishes assiduously and prolifically, with an incredible range of excavation reports to his name, including several of the final reports on Troy, which are either authored or edited by him. His 2013 book, The Archaeology of Greek and Roman Troy, provides an extensive introduction to all that is known about the site in those periods. Brian was also the curator of a major exhibit of archaeological materials from Turkey, the Golden Age of Midas, which ran from February to November 2016 to great acclaim and success. His outreach activities and service to the profession are similarly extensive, ranging from the kinds of presentation we're about to hear from him tonight to the education of US servicemen about ancient Near Eastern archaeology and history and the importance of cultural heritage preservation and awareness. He was the president of the Archaeological Institute of America from 2007 to 2011 and was awarded the Gold Medal for Distinguished Archaeological Achievement by the selfsame AIA in 2015. I know we're all looking forward to hearing from him on his topic, the War Memorials of Imperial Rome. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Brian Rose. Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, can you see the slides okay?
Yes, Brian.
Okay, good. Thanks to all of you for tuning in tonight for a lecture wherein I will try to compare ancient war memorials with the kinds of memorials that we've been building in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. One of the most interesting features of the last 20 years, which coincides, of course, with extensive armed conflict in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, has been an attempt to view ancient Rome and the modern US through the same lens, and to ask, as Cullen Murphy did in 2007, whether or not America had become a new Rome, ancient Rome resurrected in a way. In other words, is our military policy similar to that of ancient Rome? And by extension, are the monuments we build similar to what ancient Rome was building? What I will try to do today is to take you through the beginnings of Roman triumphal iconography, starting, however, with a little bit of Egypt, a little bit of Mesopotamia, and a little Greece before we move into Rome. And then we'll move into the 20th and 21st centuries, and we'll compare what's being done now with what had been done then. Before I get started with that, I just wanted to highlight the collapse of temporal distance between antiquity and the modern period, especially in terms of armed conflict. Sometimes it's easiest for us to understand modern armed conflict by viewing it through the lens of ancient armed conflict, especially the Trojan War. So it's not uncommon to see books like Achilles in Vietnam, Ajax in Iraq, or Odysseus in America, wherein there's a deliberate comparison between the lives of Homeric warriors and the lives of American soldiers fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And by the same token, looking at the kind of post-traumatic stress experienced by Homeric warriors on the battlefield of Troy, comparing that with PTSD experienced by American soldiers in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. So there's very much a union of antiquity and the modern period by virtue of the wars that have been ongoing for 2 decades. When do we get our first war memorials in antiquity? It starts really in the late 4th, early 3rd millennium BC, and it starts, not surprisingly, in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. I'm showing you an Egyptian monument in lower left from the Palace of Merneptah, excavated by the Penn Museum at Memphis in the 1920s, dating to the 13th century BC, where you see the pharaoh grabbing the hair of a group of enemies and smiting them down with a kind of hammer, a mace. This is an iconographic format that starts about 3000 BC and continues all the way through ancient Egypt. A different kind of triumphal monument you'll see on the right. These are two images from a single monument called the Stele of the Vultures, dating to about 2500 BC, and involving a combat, an armed conflict between Lagash and Umma in what is now southern Iraq, as you'll see in the map on upper left. If you look on upper right, you'll see a detail of the war god Ningirsu holding a net in which are contained the bodies of the opponents of Lagash, the warriors of Umma who have been defeated by Lagash. Hence, the war god is holding them all together in a net following the victory over their opponents. If you look below that, you'll see a group of soldiers marching on the fallen bodies of their opponents. The fallen bodies aren't so easy to see, but if you look carefully on what those soldiers are marching, they're marching on the bodies of their opponents. So these are three different ways that you can show triumph. Personifying the enemy as a single individual or a group of individuals and smiting them with the weapon of war, as the Egyptians are doing on lower left, or showing the enemy in a net, which you've used to capture them, as you see on upper right, or marching on the heads and bodies of your enemy. That's a theme to which I'll return a number of times tonight. Another way that you can show the extent of your kingdom and the extent of the enemies that you've subjugated is by showing them all giving gifts to you as a ruler. This will take us to Iran, to the Persian or Achaemenid Empire in the late 6th, early 5th century BC, to the capital of the Persian Empire at Persepolis in modern southwestern Iran near the modern city of Shiraz. And I'm showing you some reliefs from Persepolis, Darius the Great King on lower left, and then on lower right, a group of subject nation states who have all come to Persepolis to present gifts to Darius as a way of demonstrating and honoring the power that he holds over their states. So the Romans will do this as well, personifying each of the regions that you've conquered, putting them all together as a group as a way of exemplifying the scope of your kingdom, and in particular showing them humbling themselves before the ruler or giving gifts of homage to the ruler. This again is a theme to which I'll return. The Persians, of course, launched a 20-year-long war with Greece, the first 2 decades of the 5th century BC, roughly from 500 to 480. And the Persians would attack Greece on 2 occasions, one in 490, one in 480. When they attacked in 490, it was at the Battle of Marathon, which you see in the slide on the upper left. The Athenians were victorious over the Persians on that occasion, but there were many Athenians who lost their lives, not as many as the Persians, but nevertheless a sizable group. Those dead Athenians were buried in a monumental burial mound at Marathon, which we call the Soros, and you see it at the bottom of the slide. And the only decoration for that monumental burial mound containing the bodies of the dead Athenians who had lost their lives in war, the only decoration were stone slabs, stone stelae that were placed around the burial mound that contained the names of the deceased. So the casualty lists. That's the only decoration of the war memorial. This is obviously something to which I'll return as well once we move into the 20th century. The Persians attacked again in 480 and were successful in burning parts of Athens including the Acropolis in Athens, and in burning the first Parthenon. The Parthenon is a temple to Athena, the primary god of Athens, the goddess who gave her name to the city of Athens. And when the Persians attacked, they burned her temple on the Acropolis. And for several decades, the Athenians left that temple in a state of ruin as a way of highlighting the barbarity and the savagery of their Persian opponents. So a building left deliberately as a ruin, as a way of highlighting what had happened to the city in the midst of armed conflict. Obviously, in time, they decided that the city had grown so powerful that a new temple to Athena was necessary, and they built the Parthenon that you know between 447 and 432. We call it the Parthenon, by the way, because Athena was a maiden goddess, a virgin goddess, and the word for maiden in Greek is Parthenos. So the Parthenon simply refers to Athena in her capacity as the virgin goddess. Ultimately, of course, the Athenians and their Greek allies were victorious over the Persians, and the Parthenon that they would build, after having left the first one in a state of ruin for so many decades, would highlight Greek victory over Persia. But they would do it not by showing scenes of the Greeks actually fighting the Persians, but through mythological analogs. So by showing scenes from mythology of one group victorious over another group, specifically an orderly or rational group defeating a barbaric or irrational group. That's what adorned, the metopes of the Parthenon, which surround the entire building. You see one of them on upper right in its colorized form, and then in its actual form on lower right, a lapith or a Greek fighting a centaur, half man, half horse. There are a number of these motifs, each one serving as a mythological representation of the victory of Greeks over Persians. So mythological analog for the exploits of the victor. Those victors often like to link themselves to great heroes and gods of the past. This takes us to Alexander the Great, whom you're seeing on upper left. Alexander, of course, would begin fighting the Persians, whose empire had lasted 200 years, in 334. And over the course of the next 10 years, he would defeat the Persians and create an even larger kingdom, an even larger empire, a Macedonian empire, stretching from what is now southeastern Europe to the borders of India. You see him on upper left wearing the lion skin of Hercules. So if you look to his right, you'll see Hercules himself, whose head was frequently adorned by a lion skin, which he had skinned himself. It was a way of indicating that he had the power, the resilience, the courage of a lion. And it became the primary attribute of Hercules. So when Alexander wanted to show that he had the same virility and heroism as Hercules, he had himself depicted with the lion cap of Alexander. Hercules was also the mythical ancestor of the dynasty, the Archaeid dynasty of Alexander, so it worked perfectly in that respect too. And over time, every great leader showed himself with the lion skin of Heracles on his head to indicate that they had the same thing going for themselves as Heracles did. Here are just two other examples. In the center, you're seeing Mithridates VI, one of the great kings of Pontus, the Black Sea kingdom that gave the Romans so much trouble in the early 1st century BC. And then on the right, the idiosyncratic Roman emperor Commodus, who was assassinated in 192. But you see him here, obviously prior to the assassination, again wearing the lion skin of Hercules on his head. Some of you know him as Joaquin Phoenix in the movie Gladiator. During the period of Alexander, we're in the late 4th century BC, we get a number of monumental battle paintings showing Alexander defeating the Persians. This is a copy of one of the most famous of such battle paintings, the so-called Alexander mosaic. Originally a painting on a wall, the version that we have is a mosaic on a floor in Pompeii from the House of the Faun. So the original dates to about 300 BC. The copy dates to about 140 BC. And in a minute, I'll get into the reasons why a wall painting was changed to a floor mosaic. But you see Alexander at the left, I've labeled him. Darius, his opponent, at the right. It initially looks as if Darius has the upper hand because he's taller than Alexander, slightly larger, and he's got these spears pointing toward Alexander. But in fact, those are the spears of Alexander's Macedonian army who were surrounding Darius as his charioteer, whom you see behind him, directly to his right, cracks the whip over the horses to get them to retreat. And you'll notice that Darius is wearing a headdress and Alexander is not, showing the victorious hero, the king or the emperor, without a helmet or a headdress is in and of itself a sign of victory. They're so brave, they don't need protective headgear. You can also tell in this painting that Darius's days are numbered because the form of his body and outstretched hand are echoed or mirrored in the form of the dead tree in the background. It's a way of using landscape to foreshadow the fate of the doomed opponent. You'll see this used extensively by Michelangelo on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel as well. One of the other things that Alexander did to showcase his triumph was to add gilded bronze shields of the enemy to the upper section of the Parthenon, the entablature of the Parthenon. So you can see on the left side, I've highlighted those gilded bronze shields. Anyone who looked at the Parthenon after 334 would have been reminded of Alexander's victory over the Persians by virtue of those shields. It was common to highlight your victory by taking weapons of the enemy and putting them in a major sanctuary where there would be major foot traffic. The Greeks in South Italy and Sicily did the same thing. So when the Syracusans, under the command of King Hiron I, defeated the Etruscans, a group living in what is now north central Italy, in 474 BC, they took the Etruscan helmets, they inscribed their name and a victory slogan on the side of it, as you see here, and then they sent it off to the sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia, where everyone would see it. So using enemy weapons, specifically the helmet of your enemy, as a component of your victory statement. During the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, perhaps the two most ferocious opponents of the Romans were the Macedonians and the Parthians. And I'm giving you a map of both of them. Upper left, the Macedonians, who in the late 3rd and early 2nd century BC controlled much of central and northern Greece. The Romans fought 3 battles with them, ending finally in the 140s BC, and ultimately took over the entire area. Once the Macedonian threat was past, there was a new one that appeared that would last for centuries. In fact, it never really ended. This was a threat posed by the Parthians, whose center of occupation was in what is now Iran and Iraq, as well as part of Syria and Turkey, as you see in the map on lower right. The Romans lost a terrible battle with them in 53 BC, and they kept fighting them again and again and again, really until the Roman Empire gave way to the Byzantine Empire. Now let's come back to the Alexander mosaic, which I've told you was put on the floor of a Pompeian villa in 140 BC. Why was it put on the floor of a Pompeian villa, and why was a wall painting copied as a floor mosaic? You have to think of the political circumstances that surrounded the laying of this floor mosaic. This was a house that was probably owned by one of the commanders in the Roman wars against the Macedonians. So if you want to indicate your part in defeating the Macedonians, what better thing to do than taking one of the famous battle paintings showing the triumphant Macedonians and putting it on the floor of your house, so that as you walked through your house, you walked on the head of Alexander, the ancestor of the Macedonians whom you had just defeated. So you're walking through your house as you see visitors to the Penn Museum walking through our mosaic gallery, and you are literally stepping on Alexander's head. 100 years later, once the Romans started fighting the Parthians, the mosaic would serve a second purpose in that you could walk on the head of Darius, thereby walking on the head of the ancestor of the Parthians whom you were now fighting. So again, walking on the heads and bodies of your enemy, just as the king of Lagash and his soldiers had done in 2500 BC on that stele of the vultures. This too I'll come back to. When you wanted to show the extent of your empire, you could do it in a number of ways. I showed you one, as the Persian kings had done, personifying or putting in anthropomorphic form the cities and regions that you had defeated and gathering to get together into one group. Another way was to prepare monumental lists of all of the regions, ethnicities, the tribes, the cities that you had defeated, putting them all together on a victory monument. This is something that Pompey did in the Pyrenees in the 50s BC. It's something that Augustus did at La Turbie in France, southeast France, in 6 BC. So if you look at the map on upper left, A is the site in the Pyrenees where Pompey built his monument, highlighting and listing every single tribe, 882 Iberian tribes that he had defeated in the course of his wars against Spain. Augustus did the same thing with his Gallic monument in southeastern France. This is right next to the Monaco border, high on the hills. In fact, it's right at this spot where Princess Grace drove off the cliff, just to put it in context for you. You're seeing a reconstruction of that triumphal monument and the monumental inscription at the lower part of the slide, naming every single Alpine tribe that Augustus had defeated. During the Augustan period, he also erected an enormous map in central Rome that showed the extent of Roman conquest. So defining the world by how much territory Rome had gained, not looking so different from the map that I'm showing you in upper left. So showing the scope of your empire anthropomorphically and cartographically, as well as through the generation of these monumental lists. Many of the monuments, of course, showed victor and vanquished together. So armed conflict in the thick of the war. You see this in particular on the columnar monuments of Imperial Rome, the two most famous of which are the columns of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, both of which date to the 2nd century AD, and both of which survive intact. It's really quite incredible. What I'm showing you here on the left is the victory monument of Trajan, who ruled between 98 and 117, and it chronicles on the column his war with the Dacians, modern-day Romanians. And this, of course, would have been elaborately painted. All ancient sculpture was painted garishly, far more garishly than we're comfortable with because we've gotten used to the snowy whiteness of these ancient monuments. But you see a colorized version, which is probably pretty close to the truth, on the upper part of the slide, showing Romans fighting Dacians, and then a detail on lower right showing Romans having severed the heads of their Dacian enemies, presenting those severed heads of the Dacians to Trajan, who stands at the left, as war trophies. This, of course, unfortunately, is something that we still have intact as a war expression or a triumphal expression. I won't show it to you. I don't need to. You're all familiar with those gruesome photographs of the members of ISIS and the Taliban showing severed heads of their enemies, holding them like war trophies, just as the Romans held the severed heads of their Dacian opponents. Of course, the primary exposition of Roman triumph was on a triumphal arch. This was a mode of triumphal expression that begins in 196 BC and continues through the 4th century AD in Rome, through the Arch of Constantine, built just after 315 AD. What I'm showing you here is one of the more famous ones that survives largely intact, the Arch of Septimius Severus in the Roman Forum, set up in 203 to commemorate his victory over the Parthians. If you were to go to the Roman Forum in antiquity, you'd see more Roman victory monuments involving the Parthians than any other enemy. And this is a case in point. If you were to look at the bases of the columns on this triumphal arch, as I've shown you at the right, you would see a Roman leading a Parthian in chains through the streets of the city during a triumphal procession, specifically the triumphal procession of Septimius Severus and his son Caracalla following the Parthian victory. You'll notice the characteristic features of the Parthian opponent on the right, wearing trousers, which is a standard symbol of enemies from the east, and a Phrygian cap, a cap with a kind of tassel that comes down over the front. You see that again on the left. What's interesting is that the fiercest enemy of the Romans, that's to say the Parthians, wore the trousers and the Phrygian cap, and yet the primary god of the Roman army, a man named Mithras, whom you see on the right, wore the same costume, the trousers and the Phrygian cap, because he was in origin a Persian god. And you're seeing one of the paintings from one of his shrines or chapels, which we call Mithraea, at the right, one of the better painted ones near Rome. So the Eastern costume, Phrygian cap and trousers, had a kind of bilingual identity, alternately high and low depending upon the context. It could be the costume of a god whom you worshiped as a Roman soldier, or the costume of the enemy whose head you were severing in the course of battle. The cult of Mithras was a mystery cult, a cult based on a dying and rising god, of which there were many during the Roman Empire. These cults would celebrate the victory of some ancient in the cult, conquering death and rising again. You're familiar with that from the one mystery cult of antiquity that has survived, which is Christianity, and to commemorate the spiritual victory of the agent of redemption in the cult, they would use a triumphal arch format, just as the Romans had done for military triumph. So you're seeing that triumphal arch used for a Mithraic victory monument, spiritual victory monument in the upper part of the slide. And then the triumphal arch over the altar, which you would find in any early Christian church, again celebrating the victory of Christ over death and the victory of the initiates in the Christian religion over death and their hope for a happy afterlife. We often tend, when we look at the end of a church, to look at the altar. You should look at what's around the altar, which is a triumphal arch, as you've seen here with Santa Maria Maggiore. These mystery cults, as I've said, celebrate a dying and rising God. So the god dies and then later comes back to life. One way they indicated this was the use of an empty chair or an empty throne. So I'm showing you the cult of the Magna Mater in the upper two images. The Magna Mater, the great mother goddess of Asia Minor, whose cult was brought to Rome in 205 BC at the end of the Second Punic War against Hannibal. So a dying and rising god. You look at the pediment or the gable of that temple of the Magna Mater in the relief on upper left, and you see in the center an empty throne, which I've also shown you in the center of the upper part of the slide, symbolizing death and resurrection. And in Christianity, especially in early Christian mosaics, you'll see the same sort of empty chair or empty throne as you see here in the Arian baptistry at Ravenna, symbolizing the empty throne that's left following the physical death of Christ, but anticipating his resurrection and the return of a presence to that throne. All right, those are standard features of the expression of victory in antiquity: Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. To what extent do we see those features in victory monuments of the 20th and early 21st century? So the use of a monumental map to signify the extent of your conquests. Do we have that in the 20th century? We do. During the reign of Mussolini in the 20s, 30s, and early 40s in Greece, Mussolini set up a series of maps on the street of the empire that he had created, currently called the Street of the Imperial Fora, or Via dei Fori Imperiali. Many of you have seen these maps. I'm showing them to you again, upper left. The first map showing Rome in 753 BC. Just a dot. That was the year that it was founded. Then, next to it, Rome during the Republic, after Rome had conquered Macedonia and many other regions in the 2nd century BC. Then Rome during the reign of Augustus, early 1st century AD, and then finally Rome during the reign of Trajan, early 2nd century AD, when it had reached its greatest extent, stretching from Britain all the way to the Persian Gulf. Originally, when Mussolini set these up, there was a 5th map. It's now gone. But in the slide below, I've shown you those 4 ancient Roman maps with the 5th map of Mussolini, showing the extent of Mussolini's empire. Now, Mussolini's empire was a little smaller. He could claim Ethiopia, Libya, Albania, and Italy. So considerably smaller than what you see under Trajan. But the point is, he was using a technique that had been featured in antiquity as a way of indicating the extent of your empire, to highlight the fact that his empire would be ancient Rome reborn. I can imagine that he was planning for yet a 6th map that would show the extent of Mussolini's empire once he was finished. Of course, after Mussolini himself was finished, after he was executed and World War II had ended, the 5th map was taken down, which is why it looks like there's a void at the end of the series, even though now you'll see it when you go to Via dei Fori Imperiali, but you would never have noticed it originally. What about the use of a god or hero to highlight your own virility, heroism, and strength, as Alexander the Great had done with Hercules? There are a lot of examples of that. Saddam Hussein is a case in point. You see on upper left, I'm showing you a painting from Baghdad in the 1990s, showing Saddam Hussein on the left and the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar on the right, who ruled around 600 BC. Saddam claimed that he was Nebuchadnezzar reborn, just as Mussolini claimed that he was an ancient Roman emperor reborn. So you'll see you would have seen all of these paintings of Saddam Hussein and the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar together. One of the more egregious examples of his appropriation or co-opting of Nebuchadnezzar you see on the right in downtown Baghdad. For this, he used the Ishtar Gate, one of the monumental gateways leading into Babylon, which you see on the lower left as it's been reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. This is a gate dating, as I said, to just after 600 BC, and it came to stand as a symbol for the greatness of ancient Mesopotamia and was built by Nebuchadnezzar. So Saddam Hussein took the Ishtar Gate, inserted into it a colossal image of himself as a way of highlighting this very close connection between himself and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. The Shah of Iran did the same thing in the 1970s. In 1971, The Shah wanted to celebrate the 2,500th year anniversary of the foundation of the Persian Empire, which starts, of course, with the first of the great Persian kings, a man named Cyrus, buried at a site called Pasargadae in western Iran, not far from Persepolis. So the king, or the Shah, in essence, presented himself as a Persian king reborn, reconstituted. So you see him on the left saluting the tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae during the celebrations in 1971, commemorating this 2,500th year anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire. He dressed his elite Iranian guard in the costumes of ancient Persian soldiers whom you see on lower right. This obviously made them very angry, and ultimately they would depose the Shah. But we're 8 years away from that happening. The whole point here is he's co-opting the glories of ancient Persia. You remember I showed you that one of the ways that Darius had indicated the extent of his empire was to show all the nation states under his dominion coming together at Persepolis and giving him gifts as a sign of homage to his greatness. The Shah did the same thing. He brought together as many luminaries from as many regions in the world as he could, summoned them to Persepolis in 1971, just as the Persian king had summoned the nation states to Persepolis 2,500 years earlier, and they all came bringing gifts. These are the luminaries of the world as luminaries were constituted in 1971. So you've recognized some of them already, I suspect, but to aid you in identification, I've given you blue circles. Here is Spiro Agnew. Keep in mind that this is 1971, so it's before his disgrace. Here is Imelda Marcos. Keep in mind again, before her disgrace. Here is a bowing Princess Grace and Prince Rainier behind her, bowing to the Shah in the same way that the nation states bowed to the Persian king. And then Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, being escorted by the Queen of Iran. And on and on and on. They're all there to pay homage to him, as the nation states had done 2,500 years earlier to the Shah. Let's go back to the Alexander mosaic, because this has a resonance or a kind of co-opting in theory in the early 1990s in Baghdad. After the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein inserted a mosaic of George Bush in the vestibule of the Al Rashid Hotel in Baghdad. It's the vestibule. That meant that anyone entering the hotel had to step on the head and body of George Bush, his enemy. You see it had a bilingual inscription as well in English and Arabic. Bush is a criminal. So people were stepping. Saddam Hussein ensured that people would step on the head and body of his enemy, just as the commander of the Roman general inserted the Alexander mosaic in one of his vestibules to ensure that people would step on the head and bodies of Alexander the Great, the ancestor of the Macedonians, and Darius, the ancestor of the Parthians. It's all the same kind of commemoration of victory, even though it's all in essence fictive. The most interesting for me of the war memorials within the recent past that is drawn on ancient iconography is one built again by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. So this is before the first Gulf War, during his war with the Iranians, the Iraq-Iranian War. You remember what I had told you at the beginning of the lecture about the stele of the vultures. You have the god of war holding the bodies of the enemy in a net. You have the soldiers of the kingdom of Lagash marching on the dead bodies of the enemy, and you have the use of helmets as an element of the enemy, part of their armed attire that is put in a new context that symbolizes the enemy's defeat and your victory. All these things Saddam Hussein put together in his victory arch in Baghdad. You see it on upper left, it still stands. The crossed swords over the Iraqi military parade ground. That is symbolizing the Iraqi victory in the Iraq-Iranian War, which is of course fictive. It was in essence a draw. But what's interesting is how Saddam Hussein put the whole thing together. You notice at the base of these monumental hands, which are modeled on the hands of Saddam Hussein, you have the core or the crust of the earth that's being bent back as the arms or the hands thrust through the earth. And around those hands or arms are nets. In those nets are helmets. Those helmets are from the Iranian opponents of the Iraqi soldiers. So it's the same sort of thing that you saw in the stele of the vultures. Not a god of war holding a net with the enemy bodies, but nevertheless a victory monument with nets containing the helmets of the defeated Iranians, very close to the stele of the vultures, and that was deliberate. Once I was talking to Donnie George in Baghdad, and this was when I was speaking, doing cultural heritage training for the soldiers, and he told me that he had once been discussing the stele of the vultures with Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein asked to see pictures of the stele of the vultures. Donnie George showed him the image of the war god Ningirsu holding the enemy soldiers of Ummah in the war net, and Saddam Hussein said, I want to do that too. So it's not an accidental link between the 3rd millennium BC and this monument from the 1980s. Saddam Hussein did it deliberately. Moreover, if you were to look at the military parade route that goes through that victory monument, I'm showing that to you on lower right, you see the Iranian helmets cemented into the victory route so that you as an Iraqi soldier marching down that victory street would be walking on the Iranian helmets. You would be walking on the heads of your enemy, just as was done with George Bush in the vestibule of the Al Rashid Hotel or in the stele of the vultures in 2500 BC. Moving to Greece, you remember the memorial for the Athenian dead killed at the Battle of Marathon against the Persians consisted solely of casualty lists inscribed in stone surrounding this geometric shape that commemorated the heroic exploits of the Athenians. We have that as well in most of our monuments commemorating conflict and the dead who were victims of that conflict in the late 20th and early 21st century. Some of you will already have thought of the Vietnam Memorial, again an abstract geometric shape with the names of the deceased constituting the primary decoration of the monument, just as was done with the Greek Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, or the World Trade Center Memorial, which consists primarily of the names of the dead encircling the area where the towers had once stood. It's easier for us to commemorate armed conflict in the late 20th and early 21st centuries with names or with text than with figures, with an anthropomorphic element. Hence the article in the New York Times saying, finding comfort in the safety of names. We don't have victory monuments in the same way as the Romans. The Romans would show victor and vanquished. the Romans battling down the Romanians or the Parthians or the Gauls or the Celts, the Germans, but you would see one basic motif: Roman victor, enemy vanquished, enemy defeated and in some prone or subjugated position, or with their heads having been severed, or marching in chains through the streets of Rome. We don't do that anymore. When there are victory monuments or when there are war memorials that use figures, it's done differently. We no longer have images or monuments that show victor and vanquished. Can you imagine a war memorial from the 20th or 21st century that would show an American soldier beating down a Vietnamese soldier rendered in sculpture, or the same thing involving an American and an Iraqi soldier? We couldn't do it. And the range of emotions associated with those conflicts is almost too complex for figures. And you can see that when you look at war memorials where figures have been used in the late 20th or early 21st century. The Vietnam Memorial in Washington, the veterans felt that the list of names on the memorial was not sufficient. They wanted figures, as was done with the earlier war memorials in Washington. And so there were figures that were added. I don't know about you, but for me, these soldiers look lost, which is in a way a metaphor for the Vietnam War. You couldn't have shown Americans and Vietnamese fighting in place in the fields of Vietnam. It would have been unthinkable. You can only show one side. That will be the side associated with the dedicators of the monument. And what are you going to show the soldiers in question doing? They weren't quite sure when they made the monument, so they simply have them standing and looking off into the distance. The Soviets, who set up a memorial in Ukraine in 1989, and I'm saying Soviets because this is before the fall of the Soviet Union, also weren't sure what to do when they constructed a monument commemorating the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, the Soviet war in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. You can't show Soviets fighting Afghans. You can only show the soldiers associated with the dedicator of the monument. That was the Soviet Union. So you have them standing, looking off into space, or exhausted, or mourning. It simply doesn't work anymore to use figures in a war memorial. The Athenians, after the Persian destruction of the Parthenon, had chosen to leave the primary temple in their city, that's to say the Parthenon, in a state of ruin to commemorate the barbarity of the Persians. After 9/11, there were many who advocated doing exactly the same thing for the shell that was left where the World Trade Center had once been, showcasing the bent steel of the base of the building, as had been done with the destroyed Parthenon. And people often showed the ruined Parthenon in tandem with this photo that I'm showing you in upper left. In the end, they decided not to do that. They gathered all of the beams and architectural elements of the World Trade Center memorial, cut them up, and distributed them to cities throughout America for use in war memorials to commemorate those who lost their lives in the attack of 9/11. Many compared this to a kind of medieval spirit or co-opting of medieval saints' relics. How do you measure power? You measure power when you take an object of power, you cut it into pieces. Each one of those pieces possesses the same level of power as the whole that you had cut up. The relics of saints function that way. You could take a leg bone, the femur of St. Peter, which is obviously a mark of great holiness, a symbol of great holiness. You could cut it up into pieces, as was done. Each one of those pieces would possess the same level of power as the original bone that was severed. This is an indication of power. We're doing the same sort of thing as was done with medieval relics. In a way, the pieces of the World Trade Center are our relics for the 21st century. You remember that I had mentioned the use of mythological analogs as an expression of victory in war on the Parthenon. So using the Centauromache, the battle of Greeks against centaurs, these barbaric half-man, half-horse creatures as a way of commemorating through mythology the Greek victory over Persians. Do we do that anymore? Using an ancient motif to commemorate armed conflict, let me say it that, not war, but armed conflict. Do we do that? We do it, but it's a little different from what I've been showing you. To tell you about it, I have to take you to Kent State, May 4th, 1970. As many of you will remember, there were 4 students at Kent State who were shot by National Guardsmen. On that day, Crosby, Stills, and Nash wrote a song about it, 4 Dead in Ohio. And so the trustees of Kent State realized that they needed to set up a monument to commemorate that. How do you commemorate the deaths of your students caused by National Guardsmen, American National Guardsmen? What words can you use? What images can you use that will commemorate that? They hired the sculptor George Siegel to figure it out. And this is what he did. What you have here are Abraham and Isaac. Abraham about to sacrifice his son Isaac. So there was nothing from the 20th or 21st century that's shown here. The metaphor is a biblical one, showing a father and son, with an inscription that mentions Abraham and Isaac. So the significance of the composition was clear. So it's not a mythological analog, but it is a biblical analog to commemorate an armed conflict. In the end, this was too much for the trustees of Kent State. They said, we're not going to set this up. It would cause even more conflict. Ultimately, it was taken by Princeton University, which is where you will see it now. What about the empty chair? I had mentioned the empty chair as a way of commemorating spiritual triumph in the religion of the Magna Mater, the great mother goddess, which you see on upper left, or in the religion of Christianity, as evinced by the early Christian mosaic at Ravenna in lower left. Do we still have empty chairs as an indication of the triumph of the Spirit? We do. That's the main component of the Oklahoma City Memorial from the mid-1990s, commemorating those who had lost their lives in an instance of domestic terrorism in 1994. Each one of the components of this memorial is an empty chair, each chair symbolizing one of those who lost his or her life in the bombing, but whose spirit will ideally continue to be felt or will continue in an afterlife. It's the same basic idea as was done with the empty throne or empty chair in Roman mystery religion. Do we still have memorials such as the Egyptians were doing? Someone smiting an image or a representation of their enemy. We do, but it's not done in sculpture, it's done in photographs. The closest I could come to Merneptah smiting his enemies, as you see on the left, was an instance of iconoclasm in Ukraine in 2013, smashing an image of Lenin. So we still have the same sort of format involving conflict, but now done in photographs rather than sculpture. It's not the sort of thing you would ever do in sculpture anymore. but it is now done in a format that can be beamed around the world. So if we go back to the phrase with which I started this lecture, are we Rome? I suppose we are, but we are also Greece and Egypt and Mesopotamia, because in spite of the dramatic changes in technology over the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, human nature has basically remained the same. Thank you for listening to me tonight. Thank you for your support of the Penn Museum.